Welcome to Crash Course Asia. In this video, I will summarize thousands of years of Asian history and give an overview of some major aspects of Asian cultures and societies. This is only an introduction to Asia and is meant to give you some historical and cultural context before you study the regions and countries in depth. For the sake of time, I will leave things out and skip over a lot of details. If you're curious, let this be a launching point for your own investigation. Let's get started. I'll begin with a discussion of the origins of civilization in Asia, then an overview of the belief systems that have developed in Asia. The bulk of the video will be an immense amount of history summarized as briefly as possible, and then we will end with some quick notes on Asia today. Beginning with the origins of civilization in Asia, scholars recognize Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, and China as the three places in Asia where civilization arose independently. But what does civilization really mean? Experts, such as historians and scientists, have decided characteristics to define the term civilization. They mean that there's agriculture, which means planting and growing crops in order to harvest them, permanent urban settlements like cities, social structure and hierarchy, meaning there are leaders and followers, social classes, some kind of power and government in society. There is also division of labor, meaning that people have jobs. People are specialized into different kinds of activities, and people trade for the things that they need. And finally, an advancement in crafts and technology. Some signs that a civilization will have originated are things like the wheel, metalworking, irrigation, and writing. So these are all some characteristics. There are certainly other communities in Asia at this time, but they didn't necessarily meet these criteria, or evidence hasn't been found to say that a civilization up to these criteria has been established in other areas. So, looking at these, we've got Mesopotamia in Southwest Asia, originated around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Indus River Valley in South Asia, we see that's around the Indus River Valley. And China, over in East Asia, all that originated around the Yellow River or the Huang River. What kind of evidence did these civilizations leave behind that help us know that they did originate into a civilization? All that comes from archaeology. We see ruins of places, of cities like Ur in Iraq or Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, Anyang in China. And here we can see where they have definitely infrastructure. They've created these cities, buildings. They have to have people who have specialized in creating bricks and construction. On the right, we can see there are wheels. They have created an invention there. So here is some of the evidence that they would use to say these are civilizations. One important invention for civilizations is writing. Mesopotamia had cuneiform writing. Indus River Valley has a specific script that unfortunately experts have not been able to decipher. There's nothing that helped them translate this. And then early Chinese in China. All of these are ways to write down and record information. Some of them, like Chinese, started out as pictographic, so they made pictures that represented things. The Indus River Valley, again, hard to say exactly what is going on. Some of those look like pictographs, but some of them, they might be representing sounds. In the cuneiform script, it's kind of a complex system of representing sounds, not quite an alphabet. But that leads us to our next development, an alphabet. One of the world's most important developments in ancient writing occurred in Asia, specifically in this area of Mesopotamia called Phoenicia. Now we can see Phoenicia is just a really small area next to the coast of the Mediterranean, but in Phoenicia is where they started creating this Phoenician alphabet. Instead of having writing in a pictograph, as in some symbol representing an idea or a word, these symbols were an alphabet in that they are representing just one sound, one consonant or vowel for each symbol. This is revolutionary for the area because instead of having to take like a whole pictographic symbol that might represent a whole word in one language, this system can be used by any languages that have any of the similar sounds. So it spreads around to various regions, and it's much easier to adapt over time. As we can see with some of these graphs and tables here, we see some that are showing Phoenician. For example, like here we see Phoenician in the middle, and how that over time is changing to Greek and Latin. We ended up with the modern Latin alphabet that we roughly use today. We also get to the transformation to Arabic, the Arabic alphabet. We see the same thing up here, modern Arabic, similar to Hebrew. So all of these are actually quite related. These intermediate alphabets were kind of there over time, have changed. So these alphabets on the right are showing languages that are used in Southwest Asia and even into Europe with Greek and Latin. On the left side, we can see how it changes from Phoenician here to this script called Brahma. Now this is going to go into South Asia and India. We end up over here. This Brahma script is kind of the beginning, the origin point of the script that Hindi uses nowadays. So even here it's connected to the Hindi script. At the bottom, this one down here is the Cyrillic script that's used in Russian and other Slavic languages. So here we have tons and tons of alphabets that are all coming from this one invention of Phoenician. Now, moving on to our next point. Now that civilization has been established, let's talk about beliefs. I'm saying beliefs here because we might have a lot of ideas and assumptions about religions, and that word specifically, that are more modern or biased concepts, different from belief systems of Asia, especially ancient Asia. So, here we've got early belief systems in Asia are very nature-related, centering around nature spirits. So over here on these pictures on the right, these would be like little temples, little shrines set up to nature spirits on either generally a mountain. Mountains were very significant for the people of ancient Asia. Then shamanism is another term that is often used for these ancient belief systems. A shaman is a spiritual leader who communicates with the spirits or gods. Here we've got some old paintings, images of a shaman, either the person in the top right in this red robe, or the person on the bottom picture with a drum doing some kind of ritual where they're speaking to the spirits or the gods. And these shamanistic traditions are even carried on in the modern day. So here we've got two other images very similar to what's in the older paintings, but in the modern day. And this is all discussion spirits and gods. That indicates that there's more than one, leading to our next point, polytheistic. There are many gods in a lot of these early belief systems. Here we have some images of other different mountain gods or ocean gods this is mostly an East Asian tradition for these images here. It is very interesting that the majority of the world's belief systems, the dominant belief systems at least, all originated in Asia. We can see in Southwest Asia we have the three big monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In South Asia, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. And in East Asia, you have Chinese folk religion and Confucianism. There's a little star next to Confucianism because that is one of the main things that I want to separate from religion. It's a belief system, a philosophy, but not necessarily a religion. Then, in smaller print down below, we see some of the less dominant religions that still all rose out of Asia. The Baha'i faith, Zoroastrianism, Jainism, then Shinto and Taoism. So all of these religions, all of these belief systems, all originated in Asia and have spread around the world. Clearly that these are the ones that are most dominant in all parts of the world regardless nowadays. But it's very interesting that they all originated in Asia. Alright, it is history time. Moving on to the third part. We are starting with the pre-modern era, and as we start, let's remember how experts have classified civilization. Step 1, the world is in hunter-gatherers and small-scale farming, maybe. Step 2, we have the origins of civilization in our 3 regions of Mesopotamia, India, and China. At this point in the early pre-modern era, most of these are just small kingdoms until about 500 BCE, before Common Era. Step 3, we get to the ancient empires from about 500 BCE to about 200 BCE. The squiggle in there means roughly, not exactly. I'm going to show you some maps so we can visualize where all these empires are and how they were changing over those few hundred years. I want to apologize quickly for the quality of the maps. I know they're a little blurry, but they are really useful, and so bear with me. Also, I know that these maps are a little bit older, so they will say Middle East instead of Southwest Asia. I'm going to continue to say Southwest Asia. But looking at Southwest Asia, we can see on the left side the Persian Empire, very large in that kind of bluish-purple color. Then, on the right side, that transforms into the Greek Empire. So Persia may have been centered around here, but then Alexander the Great from Greece invades all the way over, takes over the Persian Empire, becomes the Greek Empire. Then in South Asia, same time, both in green, we've got the Mauryan Empire, kind of one of the early Hindu empires. And then in East Asia, on the left side, we have the Qin dynasty. Note that a Q in Chinese is pronounced CH. So the Qin dynasty, that's when the Great Wall of China was started to be constructed. And then on the right side, the Han dynasty, one of the greatest Chinese empires of the early time. Moving on to a little bit later in ancient Asia, from about 500 BCE to about 500 CE. So a whole 1,000 years here we're going through. There are smaller kingdoms emerging around the edges of these bigger empires, and some of these empires start to fall apart. There are lots of wars being fought around the world, around Asia, religions are spreading, art and invention are flourishing, and trade is relatively strong. This is when this idea, if you've heard of the Silk Road between East Asia and the Mediterranean, that's a little bit getting started. Note here, we've got a couple of things. So like South Asia, this area, instead of being one empire, now we've got a few different ones, so that's kind of broken down a little bit. Smaller kingdoms emerging in East Asia, Southeast Asia. And then this area in red over on this side, that's the Roman Empire. So that's also encroaching on the Asian territory. So Persia and their other kingdoms in here getting a little bit smaller. Then we get to medieval Asia. In Southwest Asia, we have the Eastern Roman Empire becoming the Byzantine Empire. After the Roman Empire falls itself, the ancient Roman Empire is done. The eastern side becomes the Byzantine Empire. We also have a rebirth of the Persian Empire, and it goes all the way over into the Indus River Valley. Meanwhile, in South Asia, the Persian Empire is over here on the left side, but then we get the Gupta Empire in northern India. And you will see over time that there's a trend of that there's always a big empire in the north because of this one river right here. It's easy to control everything from that river, while in the south, you've got lots of smaller kingdoms. In 610 CE, we have a huge development, the birth of Islam. The Islamic Empire, also known as the Caliphate, expands across Southwest Asia, North Africa, Spain, and into South and Central Asia. So the Islamic Empire explodes all over the world. Also notice up here that the words have changed to the Byzantine Empire instead of the Eastern Roman Empire. Meanwhile, in East Asia, we have Tang Dynasty China, some Korean and Japanese kingdoms, and in Southeast Asia, you have small kingdoms, and then all the way down there, the Srivijaya Empire, which is really thriving on trade between places like South Asia and Southwest Asia and China. Because if we're going by ocean here, this is going to be the easiest place to go down and trade. So trade is really thriving in this area right now. Then we get to the Middle and Late Medieval Age. All those large medieval empires start breaking up into smaller kingdoms. But despite that, science, technology, invention, and art are really flourishing in places like the Chinese and the Islamic empires. There are specifically some advances in mathematics in the Islamic world during this time. You may have heard of algebra, that came from the Islamic world. And Baghdad in Iraq was a center of learning across really this entire part of Eurasia. This map over here is from about 1000 CE. Then we get to 1200 CE. Looking back and forth between these two, I'm just going to move back and forth a little bit. Notice how some of the changes in the shapes and the colors are happening. This kind of indicates that across Asia, there's political shifts and government instability. One more very important event in the late medieval age are the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were when some medieval Christian kingdoms in Europe wanted to reclaim the Holy Land, as in, the area around Jerusalem that was very important to Christianity. They wanted to reclaim that Holy Land from Muslim rulers. So, multiple times over many years, they invaded from the ocean and tried to take over basically this area of Southwest Asia that they considered the Holy Land. Ultimately, this was unsuccessful. As you can see in this map, we just have a few Crusader states, but not very much. The Islamic empires were easily able to kick them out eventually. However, these Christian Crusaders did loot a lot of relics that you can see in a lot of their cathedrals back in Europe, even nowadays. Then, at the end of the medieval period, we get one of the most important and revolutionary events, the Mongol Empire. Mongols, organized by Genghis Khan in the early 1200s, really exploded across Central Asia into East Asia and close to Southwest Asia, not quite all the way into it at the moment. But this darker green spot is all the area that was conquered under Genghis Khan. And notice how he did get all the way over into East Asia, and then his grandson, Kublai Khan, was the one who expanded further into the lighter green areas. Now, how were they able to move so quickly? Why were they so good at fighting? How are they able to conquer everything? One of these reasons is that they were really good at horseback riding and fighting on horseback. A nice little painting, a drawing of Mongol armies. And so this was in some ways really devastating for the areas that were conquered, but afterwards it became an age of trade and an age of great peace. So in this large empire over this century of Mongol control, there's trade easily moving back and forth because everything is controlled by the Mongols. It's really safe to travel, easy to trade. So it's kind of an era of peace. However, there were only really two great Mongol leaders, Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. Once Kublai Khan had died, the empire started to fall apart because there wasn't really just one person to hold it together. So it was divided up amongst other rulers. As you can see on the right side, you've got boundary of the Yuan dynasty. So here we get the area that Kublai Khan kept for himself as closer to the end of his life, that he's saying this is now China, this is the Yuan dynasty, and the other area on the left side, that was all divided up between other people. Then, another turbulent event, the Black Plague. What kind of is bringing about a point where we are ending the medieval era. This is the 1300s. The Black Plague was a deadly pandemic that killed millions of people in Eurasia. It's hard to know exactly how many people, but it's estimated between 75 million and 200 million. For Europe, that was about a third of its population. But there's a lot less evidence that scholars have found to know how it affected Asia for sure. So we don't know exactly how many people. That's why the number is so different. 75 and 200 million are very different numbers. But scientists have been able to figure out that it probably originated in Central Asia, was carried by fleas, and the fleas were carried by rats. So all of this spread along the trade routes, some into China, some over into Southwest Asia, and from Southwest Asia into Europe. However, it seems that there's not a lot of evidence that it went to India, or South Asia, or Southeast Asia. So it mostly stayed in these areas across these trade routes. In any case, millions and millions of people died. It was a major reset of civilizations. The early modern era. Often, this time in world history is given names like the Renaissance, or the Age of Exploration, or the Age of Discovery. But those names are all European-centered, around European culture and events, so I'm going with early modern to make it just kind of simple, neutral, easily applied to Asia as well. After the Mongols, there wasn't one powerful ruler, so the Mongols are kind of losing control. Also remember that the plague just happened and that really devastated the world. So, local kingdoms and empires shake off Mongol control. They assert their independence and unique cultures. Civilizations and economies recover from the Black Death. And this is also a time when science, art, local cultures, and trade are flourishing again. Muslim kingdoms and empires continue to expand, especially along maritime trade routes in Southeast Asia. Maritime meaning along the ocean by boats. And so because of this, I know I just said that the Renaissance is a European term often, but based on our knowledge of what's also happening in Asia, maybe it is relevant to call this time the Renaissance, if there is also the Renaissance in Asia as well. Here we've got a map of the 1400s. As we can see, there's finally some color up in Central Asia, so that's remnants of the Mongol empires. We see some local kingdoms here. The Timurid Empire on the right side, that is also a Mongol remnant from Central Asia. Lots of regional kingdoms in South Asia. It was never invaded by the Mongols, but it's interesting to note that most of these rulers of these kingdoms are Muslim, but the people are mostly Hindu. After the Yuan dynasty, which was the Mongol dynasty, collapsed, the Ming Empire came to power. China returns to native control and becomes a thriving, powerful empire. Then in Southeast Asia, I was saying that the Muslim empires are expanding their trade, especially into Southeast Asia, and here we can see words like sultanate. Sultanate is a term for, I guess, kind of like a kingdom that is ruled by a sultan who is Muslim. So all of these states down here, all of these little countries are sultanates, they're Muslim ruled. And you can see the same word over there, sultanate, over in Southwest Asia. Moving on to the 1600s, we see expansion of the Ottoman Empire in Southwest Asia, so that's also another Muslim empire. Mughal Empire in India, also a Muslim empire. The Mughal Empire is the one that resulted in the creation of things like the Taj Mahal and a lot of really famous architecture in India. The Qing dynasty in China comes to power after the Ming dynasty. It's interesting to note that the Qing dynasty is from Manchuria. I'll show you on a map later and explain that a little bit more. And then finally we get to European imperialism reaches Asia. So the European countries are all starting to explore the world and make colonies throughout the 1500s. So now in the 1600s, they have rounded Africa and come to Asia. And so let's see on a couple of maps what this means. In this first one, I said the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. That is all of this territory. That is huge for this time period. And not only is it in just Southwest Asia, it's in lots of Africa and even parts of Southeast Europe, excuse me. So that's really significant that the Ottoman Empire is able to expand that much. I was mentioning the Qing Empire, the Qing dynasty in China. For most of Chinese history, it was concentrated more like down in this area, but Manchuria is here. So the Qing dynasty came from this area and moved down into China and conquered it, became the new rulers. Controversial for people down in China proper, who felt that it was also another like Central Asian ruler who has come to conquer them. But the Qing becomes a very powerful dynasty in time. Looking at South and Southeast Asia, we can start seeing that European colonization. Right here, the Portuguese on the island of Sri Lanka, and in Southeast Asia, the Dutch, people from the Netherlands, have made two little outposts, one in Indonesia, one in Malaysia. Then the Philippines is starting to get conquered by Spain. So here we have like little encroachment of Europe into Asia. The 1700s, an era of opposites. I say era of opposites because some countries are really successful during this time and other countries are having a much more difficult time, mainly staying independent. Remember that in the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution is beginning by the late 1700s in Europe, and that resources from all the colonies that the Europeans are bringing back to their countries are really enriching these imperial European countries. That means that the Ottoman Empire is starting to fall behind Europe. So it's starting to lose some of its territory, not quite so rich as Europe. Also remember that these European countries, now that they have explored around Africa, they don't have to trade through the Ottoman Empire if they want to trade with Asia anymore. They can sail around by themselves. So the Ottoman Empire is starting to lose a little bit compared to Europe. Britain begins colonizing India. The Dutch are starting to take more control of Indonesia. And Russia is expanding into Central Asia and all the way through Siberia across to the Pacific. While this is all happening, East Asian isolationism is really strong. China is considered the wealthiest and most populous country on the planet, and it feels like it's doing such a good job it can just ignore what Europe is doing, even though Europe is starting to colonize some territory in other parts of Asia. So we can see in this map, look at how massive the Qing dynasty has become. Now it's like the powerhouse of the world's economy, temporarily until European colonization and imperialism really starts taking a hold. You'll notice I expanded the map a little bit more this time so we can see this is Britain, that's kind of a peach color, and that is the same color as these spots here in India. So Britain is starting to colonize India. And then where there was just one or two outposts in Indonesia, now this whole island, almost this whole island, is a golden color. That is Dutch territory now. The Philippines are now totally conquered by Spain. This is how Asia is developing in the 1700s. Then we get to the 1800s. European imperialism really is in full swing at this point. Nearly all of India falls under direct control of the British. Britain and France put pressure on Southwest Asia. What that means is that they aren't necessarily colonizing, but they're establishing alliances with certain places and deals, and they're creating things called spheres of influence, where they and just them get to trade in a certain area, for example. Despite this, the Ottoman Empire is hanging on, and the British, French, and Dutch are doing the exact same thing in Southeast Asia, but they are taking a little bit more control of the territory. China is struggling to resist European influence at this time. China has been defeated in a few wars with European powers because they want to trade and they want to really open up the Chinese market so that they can start selling their stuff in China. But China is forced to sign these unfair treaties that allow foreign merchants to trade in certain areas. This specifically will give things like the island of Hong Kong to Britain. So now Britain has its base. It owns Hong Kong, or at least temporarily owns it for a certain amount of time. Finally, Japan is forcibly open to trade by the USA. It had been totally isolated, except for trade in East Asia with China and Korea, and this one tiny trading post with the Dutch. That was the only connection with Europe at all. In the middle of the 1800s, a fleet of US gunships came into Japan and said, "You have to open up to trade or else." And when that happened, Japan realized it was really behind. It was startled that technology had moved on in certain areas and that some countries were acting that way. And so they decided, we have to begin modernizing rapidly. We have to catch up, or else we don't want to end up like what's happening in China with different countries taking control of different cities, for example. So quick look at these maps. Mainly just wanting to see like the growth of British India, that moving from this area, now we've gotten nearly the whole thing. The Dutch are now controlling more of Indonesia. Those are the main things to look out for here. And after the 1800s, we enter the modern era, 1900s and beyond, the 20th century. We only have a century left, but it is a busy one, so let's get started. Trends from the late 19th century continue at the beginning of the 20th century, in that South Asia and Southeast Asia are almost completely controlled by European empires, which at this point ends up including the USA. The Ottoman Empire is carefully balancing control of Southwest Asia with these spheres of influence from Britain and France. East Asia is still dominated by China, but the newly modern Japanese Empire is really expanding a lot. Russia and Britain have also negotiated spheres of influence in Central Asia. Most of that is controlled by Russia. Afghanistan is a complicated thing for another discussion. Here we can see, this one is patched together, so it's not perfect, but bear with me. The expansion of British India, now we can see like basically all of India, including, now let's move over to Myanmar as well. They also got Sri Lanka down there from other European powers. The British are also clearly all over Southwest Asia, these parts. And down here in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong. Similarly, the Dutch East Indies, all of this is now Indonesia. We have a tiny Portuguese area over there. The Philippines now has become US property. It's a US colony. They won a war, US won a war against Spain and took the Philippines. And Japan has learned from the European powers and is starting to make its own colonies. It has conquered Korea and Taiwan. These are now Japanese colonies, part of the Japanese Empire. I didn't say it, but if you noticed, the title of this section was called Before the World Wars. That is because now we move on to Asia during and after World War I. 1914 was the beginning of World War I, a major world conflict. However, not a lot of fighting happened in Asia. For the most part, European powers fought over colonial territories. So Britain and Japan joined Britain as an ally. They attacked German possessions across the Asia-Pacific area. The Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany, was defeated with Germany together. And so really the only fighting in Asia happened in Southwest Asia around the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, some events that are important for history include a militaristic, fascist government coming to power in Japan. The Russian Revolution brings in communism to rule the country, and the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as just the Soviet Union, becomes the government of Russia. Then, in the 1930s, the Great Depression happens. This impacts Asia, although the Great Depression is mostly centered, the events, like the causes and everything, are centered in the USA and Europe. It impacts Asia through European colonies, because Europe is controlling so much of the land and the people in Asia. There is really a drop in global trade because nobody has any money, prices are dropping, and so people in Asia who normally would be selling raw materials and resources and like crops to Europe, they can't earn as much when they're trying to export because Europe doesn't have the money to buy it. One other very important event to note after the end of World War I is that because the Ottoman Empire was defeated, it was broken up, and some other European powers, particularly Britain and France, came in and decided that they were going to take control of some of this area. This map shows how the Ottoman Empire mostly became the Republic of Turkey. Meanwhile, in some other parts of Southwest Asia, we have all these things. The French mandate, British mandate over these areas. This just means that Britain and France, quote unquote, were assigned responsibility for governing the area, but they assigned themselves to do it. So they are essentially colonies. They're just taking control of those areas. Also, good to note that these are the official mandates. Some of these are independent areas, but areas like Kuwait, Qatar, Egypt, and then other areas around the Arabian Peninsula, all of these areas become British protectorates, so that Britain is also ruling and in control of them. So now Southwest Asia is, except for Iran and Saudi Arabia, very much under the control of Britain and France. This leads us to Asia during World War II. Here we're starting at 1937. 1937 may not be a traditional start date for World War II, but we are going with 1937 here because that is when Japan starts invading China, independently from traditional World War II narratives. Now, this is because Japan has learned from European powers and wants Europe out of Asia. Japan has a vision for an independent, modern Asia led by Japan, and it's kind of a really similar philosophy to what a lot of these European empires have, where, just like we saw with Britain and France, they looked at an area and said, oh no, there's no way that this area can modernize itself, no way it can rule itself, so we'll do it. Japan thinks, if Europe is going to do that, Japan might as well, and then at least a country in Asia is colonizing Asia instead of Europe colonizing Asia. So still a complicated and misguided philosophy. In any case, in 1940, Japan joined the Axis powers officially with Germany and Italy. However, Japan is not at war with any countries except for China. This just means that Japan has said that it's going to cooperate and be friends with Germany and Italy, but has not declared war on the other allies like the UK, France, and the USA. However, because Japan has joined the Axis powers, the Allies are pretty upset about that. They start in 1941 giving Japan the cold shoulder, reducing trade, especially for materials related to war efforts, and they start trying to send aid to China. Now, because Japan doesn't have a lot of its own natural resources, it got a lot of stuff by trading. It starts looking at other places where it can get resources that aren't the Allies, such as, specifically, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we know that all of those areas are controlled by European colonial powers. So Japan knows that in order to control those areas, it has to go to war with the Allies, and it decides the best way to do this is to have a preemptive strike on the USA to cripple the USA's Pacific power so we can just control the area without the US interfering. So, on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, as well as some British and US territories in East and Southeast Asia, opening the Pacific theater of World War II. Here we can see the extent of Japanese occupation throughout Asia and the Pacific during World War II. It's left a really large influence on basically all of East and Southeast Asia. They all have this common experience of Japan conquering them, mandating forced labor for a lot of people who have to work for the war effort, extracting resources for the war. And so that's something that kind of unites, uniting experience for all of those countries. Elsewhere in Asia, you'll notice that here, this is blue countries are allied, red countries are Axis controlled, or Axis countries, and then kind of the lighter pink colored are Axis conquest. Yellow is neutral. So, looking at Southwest Asia, the majority of Southwest Asia remained neutral. That meant that they didn't support either side and they wouldn't join in any war effort. So, for the most part, Southwest Asia was able to avoid fighting. India also avoided fighting in its territory, except for a small attempted Japanese attack right there from Myanmar. They were able to stop that. And because Indian people were considered British citizens, millions of Indians participated in the war. The Indian Air Force and the Navy were very successful in keeping Japan contained to Southeast Asia over there. After World War II, European countries realized that their empires are unsustainable. After the war, they don't really have money. They have to focus on rebuilding all of the devastation that occurred during the war. This leads to a lot of countries gaining their independence, and this was also due to a lot of anti-colonial movements across Asia. Imagine that a lot of these colonies are saying, we just helped you fight for freedom from Germany. Now we, as colonies, want our own freedom. So lots of countries gain their independence, and a lot of nation building is occurring. However, there are also conflicts over power in a lot of these newly independent countries. At this time, after World War II, the Cold War also begins. It's a democracy and capitalism versus communism. The allies from World War II mostly are on the democracy capitalism side, except for the USSR, which is now, it has been a communist country, and now there's this big split between democracy and communism. Aside from the USSR, communism spreads to China and becomes the dominant government there. And then Korea and Vietnam also have communist movements that end up causing the Korean War in 1950 and the Vietnam War in 1955, that are wars over which kind of government is going to control that territory. Here, these wars are specifically notable because they involved a lot of international troops, especially the Korean War was like UN-backed to salvage democracy. The Vietnam War eventually was lost, and the communist regime took control there. There are also lots of conflicts in places like Afghanistan, which did involve Soviet troops and Western support, but not Western troops. And also in Southwest Asia, specifically, that's more of ethnic conflict and this idea of like nation building and conflict over power. In Southwest Asia, the main conflict, however, was Arab Muslim nations versus Israel, which I will show you a map soon, and I'll explain that a little bit more. First, just noticing like how many new independent countries there are. All these colors are suddenly different. So moving on, Southwest Asia, there are still some lingering British territories. Eventually, those will gain their independence. But the main thing to note here is that earlier, several maps ago, we saw that this area was called Palestine, but now it is called Israel. And it's a little bit too much to get into for this video, but basically the rest of the countries around were upset that Britain, Europe, the UN carved out this territory where people used to live, and it created a big conflict there. Then we get to India and Pakistan. India becomes the Hindu state, Pakistan, East and West Pakistan, the Muslim state. Eventually, East Pakistan breaks off and becomes Bangladesh. And we also see up here, Kashmir is a very disputed territory between Pakistan and India to the present day. In Southeast Asia, perfect, British Malaya. So that's not quite Malaysia yet. It's still controlled by Britain. The island of New Guinea down here is also European. We have the Portuguese right there. And you'll notice we have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So this is kind of during the Vietnam War when communist North Vietnam is being opposed by the democratic South Vietnam. Eventually, North Vietnam wins. And our last map, East Asia. I'll leave all of those there. The main thing to note here is that we have North Korea, South Korea, North Korea being the communist, South Korea democratic, split in the middle, and stays that way to this day. Then the People's Republic of China, communist, versus Taiwan, the democratic island. We are nearing the end at Contemporary Asia, 1980 to today. Rapid modernization and development has been occurring in the past several decades, especially in countries like China, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. followed pretty quickly by Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. These countries are now fully incorporated into the global economy. This has caused living standards to increase dramatically across Asia. We'll also know that remaining European colonies have gained independence. In 1991, the USSR, the Soviet Union, fell, and that caused the end of this Cold War. This brought independence to the countries of Central Asia. There are still some challenges going on, like territorial disputes arise between some nations. I had just mentioned the one with Kashmir. There are some other territorial disputes on land and in the ocean. Some nations have experienced internal political struggles, and there are wars in Southwest Asia, often with foreign involvement from Europe or America. So then we get our wonderful map of what Asia looks like today. We'll definitely spend some time looking at this other times. And lastly, Asia today. Why is it so important to pay attention to, learn about, and understand Asia? 30% of the world's land area and 60% of the world's population live in Asia. And this population is projected to only continue increasing. Some countries are definitely leveling off in their population and not growing anymore, but others are still definitely increasing. As a continent, the biggest portion of the world economy is Asia. There are many rapidly developing nations, especially in Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia. Asian cultures are becoming more influential worldwide, and not only cultures but governments as well are becoming influential in global politics. There are still some challenges across all of Asia. It is important to note that there are massive income inequalities between and within nations, meaning that there are very rich nations and very poor nations, and inside of a nation, there can be very rich people and very poor people in the same country. There are also varying levels of human rights across Asia. There are several ongoing civil and international conflicts. However, because there are so many people in Asia and it's such an important area, Asian nations and people will be central to solving world issues. So it's very important to be at least familiar with some history and culture of Asia, so that moving forward, it can be a lot easier and smoother to incorporate Asia into the global conversation. I hope you have enjoyed this crash course on Asia. Thank you for watching, and I hope this is only the beginning of your exploration into Asian cultures.